Hi everyone. So London LDC, January 2020, the first event of the year. Thank you for all coming out. I'd like to introduce Mitchie Matthias.
Okay. Why is that one off again? Okay, there we go. Okay. I wonder if any of you have ever thought about whether or not pencils were yellow in Victorian times. This is the kind of question, one of many, many questions that I've had to deal with that have come to mind when I'm trying to make a 122-year-old book, a true story, into a graphic novel here. It's the story of T.H. Holding here, who was a master tailor. He was a cyclist from the very earliest days of bicycles. He was a multiple author, an experienced sailor and camper. And at the age of 52, he put together camping and cycling and made a new pastime, which actually led to the beginning of today's Camping and Caravanning Society, which he started in 1901, and he became known as the father of modern camping. But why in the world did I get interested in such an obscure subject as this? Well, I was lying in bed with a bad back, actually, and I heard a radio program that really grabbed my attention. It was about this camping and cycling expedition that took place in Ireland in 1897. 3 days on bicycles, 4 men sleeping in one tiny little tent designed by this tailor who made it himself. He put a small ad in the paper after the trip looking for anyone else that was interested. It led to a whole movement. There were readings from this book, and it was just so funny hearing their attempts to try camping for the first time with four men in a tiny little tent that was 5'9" on a side, and one of the men was not very small. Now I guess I'm predisposed to being interested in this because 20 years earlier I had cycled across North America one summer, so 3 months. But I had a 12-speed bike. I had like batteries and a torch. I had Velcro. I wasn't wearing a woolen suit. This was very different times, and I just had to get my hands on this book. And there it is. It took me 12 years to get a copy. It turns out it's very rare. It was quite expensive. Not the one I got in the end, but I was seeing them go for £250. Now, if I'd known then what I know now, I would have just bought it. I had no idea that it was just a whim. But I managed to get it, and it was fantastic. It was a combination of a travelogue, a sort of how-to manual with all sorts of things from how to hold the candles in your tent, how to cook for 4 men on a tiny camp stove, how to make your own tent. It was also a real good social history. It was like going back in time. A time when, especially in the rural part of Ireland where he was, people in the country sometimes had cattle in the same cabin where they were living. At 1 o'clock, people would put people would put baked potatoes out front to cool. And if you wanted lunch and you on a tour, you would go knock on a cabin door. I mean, just a very different time. You would hire blankets, from farmers. So I thought, this is fantastic. My first thought was to republish this book because it's long out of copyright. But during these 12 years that I was trying to get it, I'd actually come back to drawing again, which I'd accidentally stopped for several decades. Now, don't do that, people. But I had. And a year after I got the book, I started making my first comics. And little by little, the idea of a graphic novel, which is terribly ambitious, came into my head. I had no idea how to do such a thing, but there was one thing I knew, and that was that I was going to use his language exclusively. It's very characterful. Of course, it's old-fashioned English from 1897. It was very didactic, quite tongue-in-cheek. It really gave a sense of going back in time and his own personality. So, how to do this? I photographed the entire book and then highlighted all the parts that would be the most useful. there's not very much conversation, which is kind of a disadvantage when you're trying to make a graphic novel, but I grabbed every single bit I could do, and every bit of reported speech. All the most exciting how-to bits, any cultural references, so it wouldn't just be the story of 4 men riding bicycles through Irish roads, which would not be very interesting. And I made a few attempts to start, once I'd done this, start sketching out in notebooks, and it would keep going wrong, and I'd keep giving up. And then 2 things happened. My friend Ellen mentions a program called InDesign, in which people could move panels around, pull pictures into squares, just kind of work it out on the computer. Now, I don't do digital stuff, so that wasn't going to work for me. But I also went to a talk by Brian Talbot, in which he described plotting with Post-it notes all up and down a door or a wall or something. And he also mentions that he used a loose leaf notebook for his notes, and he could move sections around. So I put those 2 ideas together. I had Post-it notes in a loose leaf notebook, and suddenly this thing became possible. There isn't much of a story arc either here. It's hardly the hero's journey. I mean, they set off and they succeed with lots of things along the way. But one thing that I was able to do was, even though I'm not going to change a single word, what I did was I moved whole sections around. I took appendices from the back, put them into the story so it worked as a narrative. Like the first time he sets the tent up, I put that into the first day. His instructions how to cook breakfast for everybody, I moved that into the first morning. Things like that. So I made it into a bit more of a story and it took half a year, I'm ashamed to say, or I don't know what it should take, but anyway, to actually figure out the order. It was a long process, but I worked out, it came to 140 pages, and then the plan was simply take these very, very rough thumbnails, pencil them, more properly as a draft, throw that on the light box, ink them, and watercolor them. But then I realized everything has to look like 1897. What do things even look like? Well, in the book, there were 4 men on this trip. 2 of them, these are the only pictures of them. This one's Little Billy, that's Beecham. So I did the best I could with these pictures. They gave me an idea of them. T.H. Holding himself, you can find him all over the internet at different ages. There was another fellow on the trip, referred to as Frank. No pictures of him in the book at all. But I contacted the Camping and Caravanning Club archivist, and I went up there and looked through their files and got given lots of photos and things. So I got pictures of Frank in the end. And, well, you'll notice they're riding kind of strange bicycles. These bicycles were still really evolving in the 1890s. What we consider a normal bicycle today had barely been invented, really, and pneumatic tires. Some people were still riding the high wheel ones. This was a kind of a hybrid, which you pedaled at the front, and it was kind of geared so that it was meant to be safer than the high wheeler. Anyway, it's a very rare bicycle. They were only made for about 6 years, I think, between 1893 and 1899. I had to go to mid-Wales to the National Cycle Museum to see an actual one. It seems a bit important because Holding goes on quite a bit about how unsuitable they were for this trip. They were very, very slow. And he goes on for, well, what turns into in my graphic novel, quite a few pages about what's wrong with them. He jokes that he doesn't know if he's being libelous or not, but he feels it's his duty to let people know, to tell the truth. So then I had to dress these people. Well, there are loads of pictures of old bicycles and riders that you can find, luckily, on Google Images. There's also these wonderful ads. These are all old suits, of course, because that's what you wore in those days. So I had the idea of what the clothes looks like, but what color? Of course, everything's in black and white. So I went up to the British Library. I can't remember how I found out that this was there, but there's a journal called Tailor and Cutter, which from the 1890s, and they've got color fashion plates that tailors would use to show what they could make. So I was able to, get an idea of some of the colors. And there's two styles of suits. You've got your lounge suit and your Norfolk jacket. So those are basically the two that were available. I also have a friend in Lewis who happens to make costumes for theatre and film and TV period, dramas. And she gave me some swatches. So finally I was able to make a character sheet of what these guys are wearing. And I just had to decide, okay, who gets the lounge suit, who gets the Norfolk jacket, what color is their hat going to match, their jacket, what kind of socks are they going to have. So I just had to decide that for them. Now, this is from the book. I think it might be this page that really made me think I got to do something with this. I just love it. How to make your own tent. In great detail, he talks about the kind of linen he used, how to make all the fixings. He talks about how he got his tent poles made by a fishing pole maker, what kind of tent pegs you should order, how to tie clove hitches. It's all extremely instructive. This tent only weighed 2 pounds. You think of things from the past, from that time, would have been really heavy. He used the finest linen. There was no fly sheet, and yet it stayed dry because it was pitched at such an angle. And he ended up giving a lot of talks in London, apparently, after this. And one of the most common questions was, well, how did you stay dry? Why didn't it leak? But it didn't. But there were no photos of this in the book. There was only this design of how to make it. So I decided I better just make one out of paper in order to get the scale right, because I'm trying to make this as accurate as possible. I've got this little grey man. I knew the tent was 5'9" on his side, and I figured he was probably about 5'9", because in Victorian times people weren't quite as tall, and you wouldn't make a tent, any much bigger or much smaller than you were. So, but can you imagine 4 men in that tent? But one of his illustrations shows all 4 of them lined up like peas in a pod under one blanket. So they really did. So aside from this, absolutely every panel has got to look like 1897. And we're talking mail cars that are, horse-drawn, donkeys carrying peas, matchboxes, tins, the tools, the repair kits, not to mention the cottages and all that. Luckily, I don't have time to show you all those things, so. But I'm spending a lot of time on Google Images and going to museums and things like that. So, Google Street View has been an absolute godsend. I have spent hours retracing their route, because it's all in the book in great detail. So I go down the streets, see what they saw, work out how it would have looked 122 years ago where I can, and redraw it. Often I have to match it to old photos if I can find an old photo of a street view in a town. Like this one here. Here they're going into Foxford, and I have to figure out which direction were they going into the town. Where did they come from? Which way are they going? I find on Street View what the town looks like. I might find a modern photo, try to match that up to an old photo. There's sites that have old photos of Ireland, luckily. And look at maps. Sometimes I have to look at old maps, and then work out the colors. There's a specialist paint geek in Lewis, luckily, who deals with all these handmade paints, and he knew what colors would have been used on the outside of buildings back then. So that was helpful. Sometimes, though, the things you see on Street View, you don't really know. How did it look in 1897? For instance, there's something called the Round Tower that they came across, and I got a great picture of it, but there's all these gravestones in front of it. I don't know until I go to Ireland whether they were there 100 years ago or not. So, there's a little bit of guesswork involved there. Now, this one station building here took a ridiculous number of hours. In the text, it's actually described in the wrong place. He just made a little mistake about what he saw before and after it, because I spent ages and ages looking at maps, old maps, looking for disused railway lines. I even joined an Irish train group on Facebook just to ask about this particular station, and it turned out, no, there wasn't a station where he said there was, and it had to be this one. Well, this no longer exists. The train line doesn't exist. That is now a house. But I was able to find a picture of the house, and he described it as a pretty neat red station, so I just made it red. So, what's next? Well, at the moment, they are only halfway between, they're on their way to Linan. I'm roughly halfway through the book. Well, when I say halfway through, I've drafted about half of it. So, with any luck, by the end of this year, I'll be ready to start on the final, I hope. That's what I said last year. But I've done so much of the research now that we can hope. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that the language, I had chosen to use only his language throughout. And it turns out to be a really good a really good decision. With the exception of 2 people I've met, one of whom is in this room, everyone really likes the sort of archaic sound of it and the flavor it gives. But it's possible that maybe 20-something young men, it won't appeal to them. We shall see. Okay, I don't know whether I raced to that or took too much time or what, but that's me. Any questions?
From this point, how do you see it as sort of a finished thing?
Well, once I've got the entire thing drafted in pencil, I then start. Well, I've actually finished the first 12 pages more or less, but I'll probably want to finish them again. You know how these things go. But I wanted to wait till I had it all finished and I could actually see the whole flow of it before I started doing the finals. I know everyone has a different process for graphic novels, and it's really interesting how some people can just start and work their way through it. But I want to sort of make sure that I don't have like the same looking page or panels, too many times. I just want to see it as a whole. So once it gets to about 140 pages, it's done. I will then read through it, decide on any changes, and start inking it in fountain pen on watercolor paper.
Because it's very high standard already.
Oh, thank you. These are just drafts, really, but I think I'm being silly
because sort of inserted the text like this.
Yeah, so some of them I think will actually be finals already, but some I'm going to have to redo. Some of them are quite drafty. Anyone else?
Did you insert the text by writing it on a piece of paper and sticking it on, or how did you get the text on there?
In this case, because I didn't draw the entire map, as you might have guessed. I cheated on that one. I imported it, and I literally cut and pasted it, with scissors. And then, I would have written the text on paper and glued it on. But normally, I'm doing it all as one. I'm doing the text and the pictures together. In fact, what I'm normally doing is I'm writing the text first. I'm very roughly working out the panels. Because the text is really, really important for this. That's kind of the main thing, really. So I write the text in first. I even ink it first so I can really see where it is. And then I draw behind that and around it. I think that's a bit odd because most people start with the picture and then work the text in.
Fabulous. Well,
there's someone at the back. One last question.
One last question.
Okay.
Sorry.